Hello, everyone. Welcome to Out of Spec Testing. I'm Ryan, and today we've got something very special. We're going to be looking at the charging curve for the Zeekr 7X standard range with the gold battery. And for those of you who might not know, likely lots of our North America audience and perhaps some of our European audience, the Zeekr 7X is a Chinese crossover, and we're going to be taking a look at this charging curve. We do have a video on Out of Spec Reviews which tells you a bit more about the 7X, and I definitely recommend you watch it. And something I have to admit to you guys, if you're not aware, this Zeekr 7X standard range really doesn't sound that impressive. I mean, how good could a standard range really be? Some disclaimers before I start. This was an engineering prototype, so technically not a production vehicle. However, the production vehicle should charge identically. Second, only Kyle was able to drive it, and he was not able to do a range test, so I can't tell you a whole lot about the car subjectively, and I also can't show you the range versus time graph. With that out of the way, let me tell you just a little bit about the car. The Zeekr 7X is a Chinese crossover SUV. It has a 75 kilowatt hour LFP battery, and that's a pretty modest battery size. It's a bit smaller than the old EGMP vehicles, a bit smaller than the Volkswagen ID4. When you compare it to other crossovers, this standard range 75 kilowatt hour LFP battery is just a little bit smaller than the average. The LFP battery does have a big advantage though. It has much lower cycle degradation, meaning the battery lasts significantly longer. With LFP batteries, you can freely charge up to 100% state of charge every day without really worrying too much about damaging the battery. This would be a pretty bad idea with other battery chemistries and would likely lead to faster battery degradation. However, that is far from the most important thing about this battery. This golden battery by Zeekr is part of the fastest charging EV in the world. And yes, you did hear that correctly. According to Zeekr, this is the fastest charging EV, period. They claim 10 to 80% in just over 10 minutes, a peak of 5.5 C, over 400 kilowatts. To be clear, it's the fastest charging time, not necessarily delivering the highest peak or most energy, but I don't think that makes it any less impressive. One final thing to note is that this golden battery is not limited to just the 7X. It's available across many vehicles on Zeekr's range, so you could get this on the Mix or the 001, and I think that's really awesome that you can get such an incredible battery across quite a wide range. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this charges. We plug in here, and it's actually going to take a few moments for it to start ramping up and actually tell us what state of charge it's at. About a minute and a half before it really starts ramping. Of course, you can watch a full video on Out of Spec Reviews as well, but within 2 minutes, we're already up over 400 kilowatts. 2.5 minutes in, and then it boosts to over 450 kilowatts. We see a peak of 467, and at this point, we're now at 20% state of charge. Wow, 400 kilowatts is still being held. If we take a look at volts and amps, it's really quite impressive. We saw a peak over 670 amps, well over the typical 500 amp limit with CCS, rivaling what we see with Tesla superchargers. We're seeing about 700 volts, telling us this is an 800 volt architecture vehicle. 6 minutes in, we're still doing 400 kilowatts, 40% state of charge, and we're just now going to start tapering under 400 kilowatts. 50% state of charge is just 7.5 minutes in, and that's with a minute and a half of ramping up. We reach 80% state of charge, and that's just over 12 minutes in. Considering we reached 10% state of charge at just about 2.5 minutes in, that's just under 10 minutes to go from 10 to 80%. That's even faster than they claim. And it's not done yet. It goes under 200 kilowatts for the first time at around 85% state of charge, where it starts a little siesta. This is something that we've seen before on other vehicles, where charging speeds drop down and the vehicle's balancing cells, doing a BMS check, making sure everything's in order. It actually holds this for a pretty long period of time. The siesta starts just after 14 minutes, and then we don't jump back up until almost 20 minutes. It was a 5.5 minute siesta, which on one hand doesn't sound like all that much time. On the other hand, that's like an eternity for a vehicle that charges this quickly. This is also longer than we've seen for most siestas, which are usually around just 2 to 3 minutes. Once we're finished with the siesta, we jump back up to 160 kilowatts. We then walk our way back down all the way till we reach 100% state of charge. Of course, we expect this taper. Every EV tapers as the battery fills up. Still, we're holding a really impressive charging speed, over 100 kilowatts until the final few moments. We completely finish charging after just 22 minutes. Now, I want to do something kind of fun and take a short view back to the past. Well, back in 2019, the before times, if you can remember, Tesla introduced V3 supercharging and 250 kilowatt peaks. First, let's take a look at the 2021 Tesla Model Y charging, just to give you a brief idea of what this initially looked like. This, at the time, was one of the fastest charging vehicles, and we were impressed. Fast forward a year, and we have the Tesla Model S Plaid. It still charges at 250 kilowatts, but it's able to hold that till over 30% state of charge. This curve was noticeably and appreciably better than the Model 3 and Y. But it was not the fastest charging vehicle at the time. That goes to the Porsche Taycan. If we look here, it actually has a similar peak. It gets to about 270 kilowatts, but it's able to hold that until almost 50% state of charge, and then slowly walks its way down. It has a significant advantage over Tesla until around 80% state of charge. It took about 15 minutes to go from 0 to 50%. This stood as the best charging EV for many years. That was until late last year when Porsche released the new generation Taycan, and that was even more impressive. Truly a generational leap. You can see here a considerably higher peak, all the way up to 330 kilowatts from the 270, and it holds that peak much longer, holding it from pretty much dead all the way up until 60% state of charge. It's still charging quickly until around 75% state of charge. This again set the bar and was the fastest charging EV. It took about 15 minutes to go from 10 to 80%. I'll also give a shout out to the Silverado EV Chevrolet, as well as any of the other GM vehicles that have that huge 24 module battery. That Chevrolet Silverado EV has exceptional peak charging speeds, over 350 kilowatts, and the curve is not too far off the Porsche Taycan. However, it's a little bit less technically impressive because it's a much bigger battery, so a lot easier to achieve those higher charging speeds. And then we come to the Zeekr. It's got a 75 kilowatt hour battery, smaller than everything on this list, and yet it's another generational leap over the new Porsche Taycan. We saw peak charging speed of 467 kilowatts, and it held over 400 kilowatts until 40% state of charge. It was doing 200 kilowatts at 85%, and it was just over 10 minutes to go from 10 to 80%. The entire charging session took just 22 minutes, and that was even with a little bit of a siesta where it had to stop for a few minutes to rebalance and calibrate the battery, get everything going before it's going back to charging. There are plenty of vehicles that can't even do 10 to 80% in 22 minutes. Now, I'm pretty sure I've said this before. I said it charging the Chevrolet Silverado EV. I said it again with the Porsche Taycan, but this is the best charging EV, and I think it'll be really hard for another EV to beat this. I'm also more than ready to eat my words again. This is just such a huge technological accomplishment, not just to achieve the speeds, but to achieve the speeds with such a relatively small battery. Now, like I mentioned, Kyle was not able to complete a range test, so I can't show you a true range versus time graph. We can, however, make some inferences. If we take a look at crossovers, we can see that on average, crossovers typically go about 230 miles. I prefer to be on the conservative side, especially considering this has a relatively small battery compared to other crossovers. It's difficult to judge efficiency, but let's just make an assumption that it's not great. So given those two assumptions, we could take a look at, say, the Kia EV6 GT. That has a 77.4 kilowatt hour battery, and it's a really spicy vehicle. It's got big wheels and tires, huge motor, all these things working against it, so I think the Zeekr should probably be at least as efficient. Someone can, of course, correct me if that's not accurate, but I think it's pretty reasonable, and given that efficiency, the Zeekr should be able to go about 215 miles on a charge at 70 miles an hour. If we plug that figure into our range versus time graph, well, we get a pretty impressive charging result, but it's not quite as impressive as I thought it would be. It is one of the fastest charging vehicles, especially for the first 12 minutes. However, it is noticeably behind the new Porsche Taycan and the Lucid Air Grand Touring. Both of those vehicles have lower peak charging speeds, but they're also considerably more efficient, especially as sedans. It's a little bit unfair to compare a crossover with the sedan, so let's just take a look at those crossovers. And that's more like what I was expecting. This is the fastest charging crossover that we've ever seen. Obviously, it's not the longest range one, but if you want to stop for just 10 or 15 minutes, this is the best option. I think it's interesting that you can see the curve is pretty darn flat all the way up until about 14 minutes, and this is where we see the siesta. It takes a few minutes, but then it's back to charging like normal. Of course, you would probably want to unplug by the time you're 13 or 14 minutes in for optimal charging. While this is the fastest charging crossover, I am, of course, going to have to take it off this board. We need to complete a range test to have a true result for this range versus time graph. Maybe someday we'll get a battery as impressive as Zeekr's gold battery, but until then, we're going to just have the charging curve, kilowatts versus state of charge. Well, thank you all so much for watching. I was really glad to be able to share this with everyone, and I'll see you all on the next one.